And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Two Guys in a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute. That, as usual, is Daniel Rogers. Uh, Pardon me. You're going to have to excuse the both of us this evening. Uh, we're going to do our very best to get through it, but Daniel is trying to get over the flu. He's been coughing, hacking, and for the last 3 days, I've had a sore throat. Matter of fact, we normally like to film our program on Monday afternoons about 2 o'clock, and then Daniel posts it for play on Tuesday evening. Well, I was just feeling absolutely awful. My throat felt like somebody took a knife to it. So we put it off, and thankfully I'm a little better this afternoon. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I wasn't feeling well enough to do a program yesterday anyways, Don. We have a staff meeting every Monday morning, and we were talking, and I was trying to explain something, and I could just not put the words. I'm doing it right now. I couldn't even put the words together. My mind was just so foggy from being sick all weekend. So it was tough.
We will do the best that we can. By the way, while I'm thinking of it, I had sent you an article just the other day entitled Revelation Before First Peter. Did you see that?
I saw it come through, but I was probably in the midst of all that funk. I started feeling bad Thursday, and I wasn't better until I started feeling okay Saturday night, and then Sunday I was all right, but I haven't really been tip-top shape since about the middle of last week.
I hear you.
I'll have to
well, that's just fine. I wanted to make sure that you got it.
Right.
Okay.
Now, the title seems familiar. Seems interesting to me. That seems like something that I sort of had thought too a few years ago when I was teaching through a series on Revelation and First Peter. I even wrote an article on the millennium based off of First Peter and the timing and dating of Revelation and things like that. Because it seems like Peter's the short time, the little while in First Peter seems to comport with the short time of Revelation 12 and Revelation 11 and some of these other texts, Revelation 6 especially. So, and the little time after the millennium in Revelation 20. So,
well, and the linguistics is identical.
Yeah.
In so many of those texts. And I have a discussion of it in my book, Who is This Babylon, that I wrote some years ago. I've forgotten exactly when I wrote it, but it struck me then, all that time back, that, okay, you've got John writing the book of Revelation and Jesus speaking to the church at Philadelphia. I know your works and your patience and how you dwell where the synagogue of Satan is. Those who say they are Jews but are not, for they are liars. And because you persevered and kept my words, I will also keep you from the hour of trial that is about to come on the whole world.
Right.
So here is a trial. Pyrosmos is the Greek word, and it's coming. It's about to come. And then over here in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12, Peter says, brethren, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial that is among you. Now, unfortunately, as you well know, the King James, the New King James, and actually several English translations render that, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial that is to come upon you. And years ago, I was looking at the Greek on that, and I go, wait a minute.
Yeah, I think the New American Standard says the fiery trial, which is among you, or
that's exactly right.
Right.
Yes. So when I discovered what the Greek actually said and realized, I'm trying to remember which commentator it was now, but one commentator said there's just no justification for rendering 1 Peter chapter 4 in the future. There are no future tenses there. And it is literally among you. En humin is the Greek term. So here is Jesus predicting what was about to come. Here is Peter writing to the same folks, saying it's in your midst right now. Well, yeah, okay. Here's prophecy and prediction. Here's fulfillment. So who came first, chicken or the egg?
Yeah. Well, I was even reading. I wish I could remember the exact source, but they were quoting one of the early church fathers who said that Paul stylized some of his writings after the pattern of John and the Apocalypse.
Who wrote letters to the seven churches. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
I believe that was Clement who
Okay.
said
Okay.
that, if
I
I'm not
gotcha.
mistaken.
Yeah, I couldn't remember which one it was, but
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I wrote the article. It's kind of a fun exercise, of things. And in my video series that I did about 2 years ago on First Peter, I developed this extensively as well. And I actually began writing a book, believe it or not, on on the dating of Revelation based upon First Peter. And in the book, I have adduced, in what I've written so far, I have adduced something like 21 or 22 direct parallels between First Peter and Revelation. Now, not all of them are indicative of prophecy and fulfillment, not every one of them, but the themes and the motifs are absolutely the same.
hmm.
And there is enough of prophecy in Revelation and fulfillment of Peter that, to me at least, it just, I think the evidence is overwhelming that Revelation was written prior to First Peter.
Yeah, I would think so as well. And one of the main things that anybody could think back and remember from First Peter is his reference to Babylon in First Peter chapter 5, of course. But also the whole idea that Satan was like a roaring lion walking about seeking whom he may devour. Well, if he was bound during the ministry of Jesus and he wouldn't be loosed until after the millennium for a short while, then how is it that he could be walking about like a roaring lion? And I know some have said that that was a reference to Nero or something else or whatever, but it seems to me that he's referencing, Revelation chapter 20. That's what I see.
That's exactly my position. It certainly is.
Yeah,
Is my audio at a sufficient level?
I reckon it is. Why is mine not?
You don't sound very loud.
I'm not sure. Let me check. Can anybody else? Is anybody else having a problem hearing me? We'll see if anybody says. Just keep talking, Don, and we'll see what happens. All right.
Okay. Well, anyway, for tonight's program, I thought we would go from Acts chapter 4. We'll have some concluding remarks about Acts chapter 4, verse 11 here momentarily. But I thought we'd go from there to the story of Cornelius and his conversion into Acts chapter 15 and the, quote, Messianic temple, or as it is known, the tabernacle of David there. And what we might have to say might be shocking to some people. And I'll just go ahead and say it. The tabernacle of David was never the temple. It was never a building at all. The tabernacle of David referenced in Acts chapter 15 was the family of David, the sovereignty, the rule of David. And so the reason, however, that we will discuss it is because many dispensationalists, especially the older ones, they looked at the language of the tabernacle of David in Acts chapter 15. And they said, see, that's the Messianic temple that will be built in the millennium. And they were failing to understand that it's not even a building at all that's under consideration in Acts 15 or Amos chapter 9, which is the source text for that passage. So anyway, the story begins in Acts chapter 10 and the conversion of Cornelius. And we have a classic example here of Jewish arrogance. Peter is told to go down and to preach to Cornelius, a Gentile. Now, he's a centurion, which means he's very prominent in society. He's very powerful in the army, has a lot of authority, but he also happens to be a Sibomai. That's the Greek word for non-Jews in the first century, well, even before that, who had never been circumcised. They were, in fact, Gentiles, but they had never been circumcised, but they did love Israel. They loved Torah. They attended the synagogue. They even supported the synagogues financially, and they supported the Jewish people. and what have you. Well, Cornelius is one of those people, and very devout man, no question about it. But when Peter is told to go preach to this guy, his Jewish arrogance flares up. Well, I'm not sure I want to do that until, as I've expressed it on many occasions, until the Lord hit him between the eyes with a 2x4. He gave him 3 visions, or a vision from heaven with the sheet being let down with all manner of animals in it. And good devout Jew that he was, when the voice said, take, kill, and eat, he recognized some of these animals as unclean. And he goes, not so, Lord. Nothing unclean, common or unclean, has ever touched my lips. And so what the Lord then responded was, what I have cleansed, let no man call common or unclean. Now, by the way, as a little bit of a digression here, Daniel, some people say, well, this vision is proof positive that the law had already been nailed to the cross. The law had been abrogated. What's your response to that?
Well, my response is it wasn't literal food that he was asking Peter to eat. It's just a vision to get the point across that God has called the Gentiles clean, and that Peter's not to call them unclean. But of course, you could also say there was the comment in Mark where Jesus said that it's not what goes into the body, but what comes out of the body. And there he pronounces all food's clean. Well, that was before the cross. So was the law nailed to the cross before the cross? I think that this argument about the food is not really about food in so much as it was the Gentiles.
Yeah. And there's a final point on that. And that is that one could certainly argue, as Paul does in Romans chapter 7 and other passages as well, that those who had become Christians, those Jews who had come into Christ, had died to the law.
Sure, right.
And there's a humongous difference between the law dying and dying to the law. And it amazes me, and I did it myself. Believe you me, I did this myself. In fact, in my very first book, The Late Great Kingdom, real bright yellow book that I wrote way back when, I made the point. Paul is very clear in Romans chapter 7 that the law had died.
Right.
And, well, after more study, after more contemplation, years later, it dawned on me, wait a minute, that's absolutely not what Paul said. I was guilty of reading into the text what was and what is not there.
Right. They had died to the loss of the body of Christ, not the other way around.
Well, and, Paul is expressing really, really good common Jewish belief of the time. The Jewish belief was if any man had died, they died to Torah. That's just good common law. And so Paul in Romans chapter 6 says they were buried with Christ by baptism into the death of Christ. Well, if Christ died to the law by dying, and if they entered the death of Christ through baptism, then guess what? They died to the law. And that's Paul's entire point. Well, among other points. So, and so I realized when I reworked my book on 2 Peter chapter 3 and entitled it, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, I had to go in there and I wrote 2 or 3 paragraphs. And I said, unfortunately, in my very first book, I said, Paul claimed that the law had died.
Right.
I was wrong. It doesn't say that. So I explained all of that. So there is that concept. I'll never forget an internet conversation I was having with a guy, and he made the same mistake I did. He was a Church of Christ guy, and he was just adamant. Paul said the law died. I said, I want you to read the text. Read the text. And he said, it's what it says. The law died. And I said, no, I understand where you're at. I really do. I was there. Yeah, I understand that. But I said, let me ask you a question. Is there a difference between you dying or your wife dying? Well, he thought that was absolutely silly until I pointed out Paul's illustration. And he actually seemed, at least for a few moments, like he finally caught the idea. There's a huge difference between the law dying and Christians dying, Jewish Christians dying to the law by entering into the body, entering into the death of Christ through baptism, which is what Paul teaches in Romans 6, 3 through 5. Joined with Christ, buried with Christ, raised together with Christ. Well, Christ, as Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18, Christ was put to death in the flesh. He was quickened in the spirit. Well, William Bell points out that the Greek there is locatives. Okay. It doesn't mean that Jesus was put to death physically. He obviously was, but that's not Peter's point. Jesus was put to death in the realm of the flesh. Well, what's the realm of the flesh? It's the old covenant law, according to Paul in Galatians 3 and 4. So he says you were put to death in the realm of the flesh. You were made alive in the realm, or he was made alive in the realm of the spirit, the new covenant world. It's very powerful when you look at it and when you realize that Peter, although Peter never develops the flesh versus spirit dichotomy as much as Paul does, this is a really, really powerful text. Christ put to death in the flesh, made alive in the spirit. And when you see that, those are spheres of reality, spheres of function, if you want to put it like that. And realize he's not focused on at all. He is not focused at all on Jesus's physical death and being raised in a spiritual body. Not his point at all. So anyway, I thought I'd just throw that out there because it's something that's very important to understand when we come to Acts chapter 10. That was a bit of a digression, but a lot of people try to make a point on it.
Well, just real quick, continuing there in 1 Peter, if you read on down in the 1 Peter 4, it's helpful to remind yourself that the flesh and the spirit were those two spheres, those two worlds, as Don was talking about back in chapter 3 and verse 18. Because when you get into chapter 4, everybody has questions about the gospel preached to the dead and things like that. Those who were judged in the flesh, judged in the spirit. Keeping those definitions in mind as you go across that chapter division clears up a lot of the muddy water there at the first of chapter 4. So I think I wrote an article called "The Gospel Preached to the Dead" or something like that on my blog at some point. So you can probably hunt that down. But yeah, back to Acts 10. Don.
Yeah, back to Acts chapter 10. So Peter preaches. Actually, he just begins to preach. Doesn't even get his sermon out. Boy, talk about an interrupted speech.
Yeah.
As he began to speak, the Holy Spirit fell on Cornelius and on his household, and they began to speak in tongues. And Peter and all those that were with him were absolutely astonished. And they said, "Can any man forbid water, seeing that these have received the Holy Spirit as we did at the beginning?" So Cornelius is converted, he and his household. And that doesn't set too well with the authorities, with the good, faithful Jews in Jerusalem, who are, according to Acts chapter 21, who are all zealous for the law. And what that meant in their minds was you got to have a clear-cut distinction between Jew and Gentile.
Yeah. In fact, that's one of the things that they were mad at Paul about in Acts 21 was teaching the allegedly teaching the Jews that they should not circumcise their children or keep the law.
That's right. The closest we can come to this is the horrific racism that has existed in America for an awful long time. And unfortunately, I'm sure it still exists in pockets across America. And there's no excuse for it whatsoever. But nonetheless, for those of us who have, at least ostensibly and hopefully, learned that in Christ all men are equal, skin color means nothing, nationality means nothing, ethnicity means absolutely nothing in Christ. We're all one, we're all equal in Christ. So for those of us who have hopefully learned that lesson, it's difficult for us to grasp how segregated Israel was. in her history, in her experience. And so one can understand, number one, Peter's reluctance to go into the house of a Gentile. Now, by the way, another very quick digression here. For those who try to say that Cornelius was actually an Israelite, why would Peter have any reluctance whatsoever to preach to an Israelite? They are, after all, God's people. They're alienated from God, to be sure. They were scattered abroad, to be sure. But the opportunity for a good, faithful Jew to preach to an alienated Israelite, to bring him back into the fold, what kind of joy would that create on the part of a good, faithful Jew? And so for those people who try to say that Cornelius was actually an Israelite, that just doesn't work. Because the restoration of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, was part and parcel of the hope of Israel. That bringing back and the restoration of Israel. Did you have something to say? Looked like you were ready to say something.
Well, I was thinking if that whole argument is based off the idea that I only came to save the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Well, if Peter understood that, then why would he be reluctant about going to Cornelius?
Well, that was my point, obviously, that not only should he be glad, but he ought to follow Jesus's, precedent. And he ought to have said to the angel, now, look, angel, Jesus only came to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. You got to remember that. So if Jesus said he wouldn't go into anyone but Israel, and now you're wanting me to go to Israel, I want to be thrilled to go to somebody in the house of Israel. The whole argument of this, what's known as Israel only, is really just ridiculous. It's not textual. It's not contextual. There's nothing biblical about it. It's a misuse of hermeneutic. Okay, to go on now. So the news of the conversion of this Gentile, this man named Cornelius and his household, what's interesting to me is in Acts chapter 11, once Cornelius was converted, in Acts chapter 11, you have different believers going to other Gentile regions and converting Gentiles. It's almost like there were a lot of Jews that were more broadly minded, more open-minded than even Peter. But when they saw Peter taking the lead of preaching the gospel to Gentiles in all of these pagan cities, they did. Well, again, that presented a little bit of a problem to the authorities in Jerusalem. And so you have the spreading of the gospel. You have Acts chapter 9, of course, before Cornelius is converted. Pardon me. You have the conversion of a man by the name of Saul, who came to be known as Paul. And when the Lord converted him, he said, Saul, I'm going to send you to the Gentiles. Now, right then and there, Paul undoubtedly knew he was in a lot of trouble because he knew what his brethren were like. But he said, the Lord said, I'm going to send you to the Gentiles. I'm going to send you to your own people. Then I'm going to send you to the Gentiles to show them, to bring them out of darkness into light, to offer them repentance and remission of sins, and to give them life. Well, okay. Then Peter steps in with the keys to the kingdom and converts the first of the Gentiles. And then you have Paul and Barnabas in Acts chapter 13 going on a Gentile mission. They go to Antioch, for crying out loud. Antioch was although it certainly had, as the record indicates, although there was a large population of Jews there, Antioch was a Gentile city, dominantly Gentile. But Paul and Barnabas go there, and they preach the gospel there. They go to Lystra, to Pisidia, and they preach in these pagan centers, and they convert people out of idolatry. So much so that the people, is it Pisidia where Paul was stoned? I've forgotten.
I don't recall right offhand.
It's in Acts chapter 14. Anyway, the Gentile pagans in the city were so upset at Paul's success in converting Gentile pagans to Jesus as Messiah that they take him outside the city and they stone him. So we give all of this background that beginning in Acts chapter 10, there was actually an active Gentile conversion rate. And it expanded with Paul and Barnabas in Acts chapter 13 in a very successful Gentile mission in which they go to all of these, pardon me, all of these, shall we say, pagan and Gentile cities. They go into the synagogue first, but they also preach to the pagans and they convert them. So the news gets back to the brethren in Jerusalem, the good, faithful Jews. By the way, let me look this up because this is
Lystra, I believe.
Lystra.
Yep.
Yeah. It was at Lystra that Paul was stoned.
There's about four. It says they went here and they went here and they went here and they went here. So I was trying to find the last one and making sure I wasn't skipping.
Yeah. Well, I never have been good at Paul's missionary journeys. For some reason or other, I just never could get those locked into my memory. I might memorize the verses of what happened in those cities, but I never got the actual itinerary down. Yeah. So it's kind of crazy.
I'm much better Acts 17 on, with Thessalonica and Berea and all of them.
Yeah.
I guess it's just because of studying the background of Romans, but anyways. Yeah.
Okay. In Acts 15, another issue arose. And this arose because all these Gentiles are coming into the church. They're being converted to Christ. Now, mind you, the conversion of the Gentiles was an eschatological promise found in the Old Testament, which raises questions itself about why Peter would be reluctant even to preach to Gentiles. But that's an interesting study all by itself. But the point of it is, once the Gentiles begin flowing into the church, a group of really, really law-zealous Jews begin to say, Acts chapter 15, certain men came down from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Therefore, when Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and dispute with them, they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain others of them should go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders about this question. So being sent on their way by the church, they passed through Phoenicia, Samaria, describing the conversion of the Gentiles. Now this is what's interesting, that caused great joy to all the brethren. So here are these Gentile Christians, get it right in a minute. All these Jewish Christians who have been converted out of the synagogue, now they're hearing about the conversion of the Gentiles. And they're thrilled about it. That's remarkable in light of Peter's actions and in light of the Judaizers' actions as well. So, in Acts chapter 15, verse 4, when they had come to Jerusalem, they were received by the church and the apostles and the elders, and they reported all things that God had done with them. But some of the Pharisees who believed rose up saying, it is necessary to circumcise them and to command them to keep the law of Moses. The famous Judaizers in the church. Now, Daniel, I've got a question for you. Where do you suppose that the Judaizers got the idea that Gentiles had to be circumcised to be a member of the Messianic kingdom? Nope.
Testing now. Can you hear me now?
There you are. There you are.
I've had some problem with this cord. I noticed the other day I'd bump it just right and it would come out. So hopefully I'm okay now. Okay, where did the Judaizers get the idea that they would need to be circumcised in the Messianic kingdom? Well, I know that it could have come from Torah, which said to circumcise the foreigner in their land that was going to join themselves to the covenant. But where did they get this idea, Don, that they had to have that to be in the Messianic kingdom? Where did that come from?
Well, you're trying to turn the question back on me.
Yes. Well, it could be. I can keep guessing here. Matthew chapter 5, 19 and 20. Jesus said, if you command one person to annul one of these commands, then you'll be called least in the kingdom of heaven. They could have been thinking, well, hey, we've always had the case where Gentiles who join themselves to the covenant in order to be ritualistically pure, in order to enjoy fellowship in the temple or the tabernacle, they'd have to undergo these identifying procedures and the rituals and things like that. So why not now? We still go to the temple. We're still observing the law. We still keep the feast days. So if they're going to be a part of us, shouldn't they keep these things as well?
I have felt for a long time that was probably part of it.
Yeah.
Therefore, what you're saying is these Judaizers could appeal directly to the words of Jesus himself, who said, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments, and he was clearly talking about Torah.
Right.
In Matthew chapter 5. He's talking about the law of Moses. And so here the Judaizers are saying, look, guys, we're honoring what Jesus said. So I believe, however, that Isaiah 52 is actually maybe not their go-to verse, but I really believe that it played a critical role. Now, do I have any documentation for this? Let me be very, very candid here. I have not found any ancient sources, none of the patristics that I am aware of. Certainly I could have missed them because I'm not a patristic scholar. I do read them, but nonetheless, I'm not aware of any ancient source that relates for us that the Judaizers were appealing to Isaiah 52. But what does Isaiah 52 have to say? Awake, awake, put on your strength, O Zion. Put on your beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city, for the uncircumcised and the unclean shall no longer come to you. Pardon me. Shake yourself from the dust. Arise. Sit down, O Jerusalem. Loose yourself from the bonds of your neck, O captive daughter of Zion. Now, I want to tell you, these few verses are absolutely chock full of messianic eschatological motifs. It is written in the context of Israel being in bondage. Okay. But the Lord promising that captivity, that bondage, was going to be reversed. And Jerusalem, and here's what's amazing to me about this, Daniel. We are generally told that Isaiah was written during the period of the Assyrian captivity. But here it is talking about the restoration of Jerusalem. So either the concept of first Isaiah, second Isaiah, and third Isaiah has some merit, or in chapters 40 and following, we have a prophetic foreshadowing and discussion of the last days restoration of Israel. Now, there are a few monkey wrenches in that, because in Isaiah
45 with Cyrus,
Isaiah 29 to 37 with Assyria before the walls of Jerusalem. So I understand and I acknowledge that there's some monkey wrenches
it would be really cool if the whole 39:27 worked out, Old Testament, New Testament, you know, the 39 chapters at the front dealing more with Old Testament history, the 27, it's just a little off. If Isaiah like 2 through 6 was somewhere else, and
I agree.
25 through 28, just a little bit and we would have had it.
Yeah, exactly. But here's the point. Here we have a prediction of the restoration of Zion. Now, as we've mentioned on this program, and as William and I discussed on this program many times, the concept of the restoration of Zion not only had a prosaic and literal fulfillment in the return from Babylonian captivity, but that was not the time of the remarriage of Israel, the restoration of Zion in the Messianic wedding. Now, could that be classified as resurrection? Absolutely. And by the way, this is one of those areas that, in my estimation, far too few Bible students are familiar with the concepts. As John Watts, in his commentary on the book of Isaiah and the Word Biblical Commentary series teaches, he points out that for Israel, life was to be found in the land and in the city. To be separated from the land and the city was to be dead. To be restored to the city and to the land was resurrection. Well, we find that concept in Ezekiel chapter 37. Both houses of Israel are in bondage. They are in captivity. How does God depict them? They are in the graves. That's what Ezekiel 37 teaches. But the Lord promises, I will bring you up out of your graves and restore you to the land. So the whole concept, and by the way, there are many other passages that we could give here. The whole concept is that in the mind of the ancient Israelites, in the mind of the Jews, they thought of life and death in corporate terms. The nation of Israel, the people of Israel. And by the way, there's a scholar by the name of Sullivan. Oh, what's his name? I've forgotten. Last name Sullivan. He wrote a book on the New Covenant and life and death. And just like Watts and just like N.T. Wright, just like a host of other scholars are increasingly recognizing, Israel thought of life and death in corporate terms. And so here is Israel in bondage, in captivity, in the graves, being promised that they would return, and that is to say, they would be resurrected. Isaiah 27 is one of my favorite passages on this whole thing. Has he, that is Yahweh, struck him, that is Israel, as he has struck those who struck him? Yes, in part by sending him away. God had struck Israel, had slain Israel partially. How? How had God killed Israel? By sending her into bondage. Bondage was death in the mind of the ancient Israelites. Go ahead.
Well, I was just you've already touched on this a little bit, but that's why I love that passage in Isaiah 52 about coming up out of the dust, loosing the yoke of bondage off of her neck, and things like that. But also, Don, that passage is very similar to not just that Revelation 21 language that we're familiar with from the first few verses there about no more will there be a voice of weeping or anything like that, or wipe away all tears, but also the very last couple of verses of Revelation 21, where he even says that no unclean thing would ever enter the city again. And so that unclean language, the uncircumcision language of Isaiah 52, is found in other prominent Messianic texts, like Isaiah 35, there will be a highway, and there will be no unclean person that will travel that highway. Isaiah 66, those who would enter into the new heavens and new earth and join themselves to this new priesthood would be those who purified themselves. And then, of course, the passage I mentioned in Revelation 21 about no unclean person allowed into the city. So I can see that as a potential source, like you're talking about, of their confusion in Acts 15. But there's also plenty of other sources that if they were reading it in that way, you could see how it would be easy to walk away with a very physical sort of outlook.
Yeah. And I think that's what was happening. It seems to me that, pardon me, it seems to me that the Judaizers had to have kind of a strange admixture between spiritual fulfillment and literalistic. Because, I mean, after all, if they accept Jesus as Messiah, if they accept the church as the new creation, which Paul would refer to it as in 2 Corinthians 5:7, so if, or 17, excuse me. So if they could see the spiritual fulfillment of that, then why could they not see, as Paul explicated very well later on, of course, later than Acts chapter 15, but he says, you indeed were circumcised with the circumcision not made with hands, in putting off the body of flesh and the circumcision of the heart. Well, he's arguing against the Judaizers who say, got to be circumcised, got to be circumcised. And Paul is saying, you're exactly right. I agree with you 100%. Only guess what, guys? It's not circumcision of the flesh,
right?
Circumcision of the heart. So again, it seems to me that the Judaizers had this strange admixture of accepting the spiritual nature of the kingdom on some levels. But at the same time, there's, oh, no, you got to keep the law of Moses. You got to be circumcised. Oh, by the way, you got to keep the feast days, new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths.
Yeah, and I think until the temple fell, that would be a prominent misunderstanding, which, as you know, is one of the issues behind Hymenaeus and Philetus in 2 Timothy chapter 2, is if the resurrection had already happened prior to the temple falling, that would mean that the temple in Jerusalem would be a permanent fixture of the new covenant, which would end up alienating half of the priesthood from being able to enter in, right? So if the temple being such a central aspect of their religion, also sort of hints at why they saw circumcision as such a necessary thing in the first century for the Gentiles.
And let's face it, you touched on a point earlier, you didn't develop, but you talked about having to keep the identifying markers of Israel.
Right.
The Judaizers obviously continued to believe that you had to have the external markers that identified you and set you apart from the rest of the world. And I mean, there are just all sorts of ancient sources that point out for the Jew, circumcision and Sabbath, those were the two key identifying markers. So what does Paul do in Colossians chapter 2? He says, circumcision is important. Circumcision is vital. It's critical. But guess what? Circumcision of the heart. It's not circumcision of the flesh. And by the way, don't let anybody judge you in respect of new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths. So Paul mentions the two key, and by the way, the feast days were, I'm not going to say equally as important as markers for identifying Israel, because the reason I say that is that although they were very, very important for identifying Israel as God's people, other people, virtually all of the cities of the Roman Empire, had their own feast days. They have what is infamously known as the Bacchanalia, which are nothing but drunken sexual orgies that were held on several days during the year, in which slaves could do almost anything, literally almost anything short of murder, and no repercussions at all. And so those were feast days that other people had that linked them to the Saturnalia, to the pagan gods and goddesses. The Jews had their feast days, and they were distinctive because, well, They were not drunken orgies, that's for certain. And so there was that delineation in the outworking of the feast days, but nothing, nothing set the Jews apart from the rest of the world as much as did circumcision and the Sabbath. I've been working on a book on the Sabbath for a good 7 years now. And I have documentation after documentation after documentation from ancient writers who literally scoffed at the Jews, number one, for circumcision. Like, why would anybody do such a thing to themselves?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I could relate to that, but nonetheless.
Yeah. Somebody I heard, they did a sermon on the circumcision of Abraham, and it was called, "You're going to do what to my wife?"
Yeah. Well, I will simply tell this very quick anecdote. I was 11 years old. Got to be real careful here.
Okay.
I was 11 years old. I had to go into the hospital to have my tonsils removed. When I came out of surgery, I discovered that they were a little low with their knife.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. I never trusted mom and dad after that.
Oh, man.
Never, ever, ever did I trust mom and dad after that. Never.
Oh, boy. Wow.
Yes.
That was,
Talk
not
about
ready
a rude
for that.
awakening.
I was not ready for that at all. Okay.
Yeah, well, I wasn't either.
Yeah. So,
okay, moving right along now. The fact that Israel practiced physical circumcision was not only strange, it was an abomination to the nations around them. But it set them off from the nations. And the Sabbath was, according to some sources, almost more of an idiosyncratic thing, because the nations didn't know anything about a day off except those occasional Bacchanalia feasts. But those were not weekly feasts.
And we forgot about it too.
Yes, that's exactly right. So here is Paul addressing this Judaizing tendency, this Judaizing doctrine. You have to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses. Well, you see, the law of Moses included the new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths. Part and parcel of it. And matter of fact, as I have expressed many, many times, when Jesus said, "Not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law until it's all fulfilled," the feast days constitute a really, really, really big part and a really, really big bunch of the jots and tittles. And so I've got to tell this story. Over the last several days, I've been going back and forth.
Okay, I'm scared.
Do what?
But I'm scared. I don't know what's going on.
No, not going there again. Over the last several days, I've been going back and forth with a guy on YouTube. Well, he's absolutely adamant that the law of Moses passed away and was nailed to the cross. And I said, well, Paul in Colossians chapter 2, verse 17 says, "Don't let any man judge you in respect of new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, which are present, active, indicative, shadows of good things that are about to come." I said, how can you say the law was nailed to the cross when Paul, writing 30 years after the cross at least, said the feast days, the last 3 feast days at least, remained as shadows of the things that had not yet come, which means they hadn't been fulfilled. So I cited Matthew 5, 17 and 18. So he immediately writes back and says, those final 3 feast days are still shadows of things that have not yet come. I rocked back in my chair a little more than you just did.
Well, I've got the I can't.
You got the lumbar support. Yeah. Okay.
I can.
I said, do you not realize that you just contradicted yourself?
Right.
You just said the law of Moses nailed to the cross. That means it's annulled. Then you turn around and tell us that the feast days are still shadows of things that haven't been yet fulfilled. And he goes, He comes back and he says, the law of Moses is not in effect. And I said, dude, you're just all over the map. You got to make up your mind. Well, then he came back a little bit later today and said, Paul said that the law was abrogated. And he goes to Ephesians chapter 2, the commandments, the ordinances, et cetera, et cetera. And he says, Paul says that they were annulled. He said, Don, you ought to study and learn what the word katargeo means. And I wrote back and I said, I know very good and well what katargeo means. I started to tell him I knew what it meant before he was even born, but anyway, I didn't. And I said, you just entrapped yourself again. You just said that Jesus, or that Paul taught, that Jesus katargeoed, annulled, destroyed, took out of the way the commandments of the law of Moses. That includes the feast days. But Paul himself said that the feast days, when he wrote Ephesians and when he wrote Colossians, was still in effect as a shadow of the good things to come. You know, I'll be really honest. There are times when I just think to myself, why am I wasting my time with someone who has closed their minds so obviously to what the text says and refuses to even see what they have written or what they've typed with their own fingers? The law of Moses nailed to the cross. Oh, but wait, the law of Moses is still in effect until the end of time. You don't see a contradiction? Well, of course he does. That's the problem. He sees the contradiction, but he refuses to acknowledge it. Now then, so here's Isaiah 52, and we're almost out of time here. Here's Isaiah 52. Put on your beautiful garments. Well, you see, this is a continuation of the wedding motif that we can go all the way back into Isaiah. And just for convenience sake, we go back to Isaiah chapter 62. And the promise of the remarriage of all 12 tribes. Pardon me. God had divorced Israel, the 10 tribes. He would divorce Judah and Benjamin in the last days. But this is amazing to me. I pointed this out in a discussion on YouTube, it was last year, I guess. What is so fascinating about Isaiah 52 and what is so fascinating about Isaiah chapter 62, we are dealing with texts that are ostensibly written at a time when both houses of Israel are in bondage and in captivity. Unless, of course, you want to say that Isaiah 52 and following was not written by Isaiah like Jesus said it was when he cited these passages. So, my point is this. Here we have the prophecy and the prediction of the restoration of Zion. But in the context, in the historical context, the temporal context, that means it is a promise of the restoration of all 12 tribes. And you see, God promised that he would betroth Israel, the 10 tribes, to himself in the last days, but he'd also betroth Judah to himself. In other words, he would remarry all 12 tribes, but he could only remarry all 12 tribes after, as Hosea 9 expresses it, or is it chapter 8? Judah, chapter 6. Judah would have her harvest, the same kind of harvest that the 10 northern tribes had. What kind of harvest did the 10 northern tribes had? She was divorced. She was departed from by Yahweh, and she died. That was her harvest. And in the last days, Judah would have the same kind of harvest. That's what Revelation is all about.
Well, okay? It's just interesting that the three children, Lo ami, Laruhama, and Jezreel, God, no mercy, not my people, God sows. That Peter references the first two, but he doesn't reference the last one because that was in the process of taking place.
Exactly
The
right.
harvest, right? And so when he talks about how they had been sown with an incorruptible seed in 1 Peter 1 and how judgment was ready to come on the household of God, it just it's astonishing the way that Peter's using the text to make that point about Jezreel judgment. The harvest is right at the door, right? The judgment.
That's exactly right. Peter's use of Hosea, not to mention the rejected stone motif, but others as well. But his use of Hosea is incredible. And I used this, by the way, in one of my debates with Dr. Michael Brown. And it literally blew him away. He did not know how to handle it. And I have had I haven't counted them. I have had numerous people who watched our debate, both of our debates, tell me they had been lifelong followers of Michael Brown. They had never seen him flummoxed before, but after watching both debates, they're now full preterists.
Wow.
I mean, I've had several people tell me that.
Well, if I might plug something for you, if you're listening and you haven't downloaded Don's audio class on Hosea, you should. Well, how many audios was that, Don, that you published?
32.
32 audios on Hosea. I listened to all of them back in 2016 or so. And man, that was a great class. But those connections that you draw between Hosea and 1 Peter, do you include some charts, don't you, on the downloads for that? Yeah,
yes.
it's incredible. You got to go listen to all 32 if you can.
I absolutely loved my study of Hosea. And by the way, I've been intending to do a study on Zephaniah and Zechariah in the same way. I just haven't gotten to it.
What's wrong with you?
I don't know. I just don't know. So anyway, so in Isaiah 62, the Lord says that Israel would no longer be called forsaken, no longer be called divorced or unmarried, but she would be called Beulah. And when would that be? Well, Isaiah 62, verse 7, when I restore the fortunes of Israel, and he uses the word diorthosis, a passage we've looked at, a word that we've looked at in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 10. And that restoration, that reformation, that restoration of the fortunes of Israel, when Zion would be restored, would be when the Lord would come with his salvation and reward every man. A passage that Jesus quotes from in Matthew 16, 27, 28, the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with his angels and shall reward every man according to his works. Even G.K. Beale, in his book on the New Testament use of the Old Testament, points out that Jesus is drawing directly from Isaiah chapter 62 in this passage. Well, Isaiah 62 is about the restoration of Israel at the coming of the Lord. And that's just absolutely remarkable how Jesus puts that in the first century. Well, as I look at the clock, and I know we started just a moment or two later, but it appears that we are out of time. Want to say, folks, thank you very much for joining us here on Two Guys in a Bible. Daniel, you'll have to remind us where to pick up in Isaiah chapter 62 and 52 next week.
Of course.
Write that down. So anyway, folks, thanks for joining us again here on Two Guys in the Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. With that, I'll say good night. God bless. Good night, Daniel.
Good.